Welcome, everybody. This is Simon Turpin of Answers in Genesis UK, and we are continuing to do some of our recorded sessions on Zoom for you while we're in this period of lockdown still. And today we're going to continue part 2 of a series we started last week on the uniqueness of human beings. And I've got with me today my guest, Dr. Nagy Iskander. Nagy is a retired surgeon, and he has spent many years now in the field of creation apologetics. So, Nagy, it's good to have you back with us.
Thank you, Simon. It's lovely to be here.
And so last week we talked about the spinal column, and Nagy this week will continue some of that work on the human skeleton, showing that we could not have evolved from ape-like creatures, how man is unique. So right now I'm just going to hand back over to Nagy, and he's going to take us through his second part of this wonderful presentation.
Thanks, Simon. Yes, we are going to talk about the uniqueness of human as a group and created by God in Adam and Eve, and we are their descendants. This is different from what the world thinks, that we came from common ancestor and one branch became the apes and one branch became the humans. I just want to remind you of the short clip by Sir David Attenborough talking about what do you think you are, who you think you are. And he will come to a conclusion which is completely different from the conclusion we believe in the Bible. And we will debate that issue. And we are discussing the skeleton, how we walk and move from one place to another using our skeleton and the different joints. And last week we spoke about the spinal cord. We will finish that part and move on to talk about the hip joint and the knee joint and the foot and the ankle joint as well. So let us listen first of all to Sir David Attenborough in his answer to the question, who do you think you are? So let us listen for a few minutes.
I'm going to take you on a journey to discover who you really are and where you came from. But you're not just going to sit there listening to me. You're going to be part of the experience, and you'll be able to examine some of the evidence for evolution along the way. If you have a look at your screens now, you can rotate the modern human skull, and you'll see the domed forehead, the small face, the small front teeth, and on the lower jaw, a chin. If you keep looking through your screen, you will see Australopithecus afarensis, an extinct hominid who lived about 3 million years ago. Deep anglers live at a depth in the ocean below 1,000 meters where there's no light, so they're living in total darkness. They are fishy ancestors that first developed some of our most fundamental features: our skeleton, jaws, and 4 limbs. Hold up your screen and look through it one last time. You'll see the tree that represents all of life, past and present. We started this film with a question: who do you think you are? And we can end it with an answer. You are, undoubtedly, like every other living thing on earth, a member of one single family of life, descended from a common ancestor living thousands of millions of years ago.
So Sir David Attenborough, in his address to this question, who do you think you are, came to a conclusion, and he said you are definitely part of a big family, came from common ancestor, lived millions of years ago, and started life on Earth, and life started to flourish in different branches. And also he mentioned something interesting about the fish, and they said this is my fishy ancestor. And because the fish developed a spinal cord and the leg, that's why we have 4 limbs, and that's why we are walking straight, and we have a brain, and we have a jaw, and all of that. The other thing that he highlighted is the intermediate, that he called it Australopithecus afarensis, which is called Lucy. It's actually, we'll devote a full session talking about Lucy as an intermediate, and we'll see that they discovered only 40% of each skeleton. So we'll keep that aside, but we'll continue about our human body and the skeleton. You remember, obviously, in order to walk, we need a skeleton, and we have 206 bones, and they are arranged in a wonderful way to allow us to walk and to move and to run. And these are the muscles that controls them. And these are the names of the muscles really, and the importance of every one of them. We have about 600 muscles in our body. So that is the spinal cord we discussed last episode. And that is at the back here. And that's the brain, and the spinal cord comes in, and the nerves come from the side to feed into the body. And in order for that to work, we need a circulatory system, we need a heart to pump the blood, and we need this blood when it is oxygenated and going into big vessels, then smaller vessels to come to capillaries, where the exchange of oxygen happens between the tissues and the blood. Then the deoxygenated blood, the blue here, has to come back and go to the lung to be oxygenated and circulate again. So that is the spinal cord. We have the cervical spine, we have the thoracic spine, we have the lumbar spine, and we have the sacrum. And all these curvature are important, very important, because it gives us the posture that we have. You remember we
the cervical spine curves slightly inward. The mid-back or thoracic spine curves outward. The outward curve of the thoracic spine is called kyphosis. The low back, also called the lumbar spine, curves slightly inward. An inward curve of the spine is called lordosis.
This is very important really to understand, because all these curvature are essential for keeping our posture and allowing us to walk in two. And we'll see that even more when we discuss the hip joint. So let me just explain this diagram before us. These are the apes, and you see the spine is a straight line here. And you notice that the skull is smaller than the human skull. It is about 400 cc. The human skull is about 1,200 to 1,400. And you find that the upper limbs are longer than the lower limbs. And this is the pelvic bones. This is the sacrum, and this is called the ala of the sacrum. And this is the cavity where the hip joint will form. It is ball and socket. It's called ball and socket, and we'll discuss that in detail. So this section of the screen explains the apes. This section explains the humans. So the skull is bigger, the cervical spine is different, and the point of entrance is completely different actually to the skull. And the thoracic spine and the lumbar spine are completely different. The arms are shorter than the legs. And the structure of the pelvis here, this is the ala of the sacrum, they are completely different. It's very wide, because that is helping in the standing position with the different angles. There are a lot of factors to achieve the standing position. Let me just explain something again about the posture. There is something called the center of gravity, and it is an imaginary line. In humans, it runs behind the ear here and goes at the hip and in front of the knee and comes down here. So that will keep us the posture straight. See that line when it comes to apes? It is behind the ear and it is in front of the hip and behind the knee. So that is, the mechanics are completely different. So this ape cannot just keep trying to strengthen the spine and form in these curvatures. It doesn't happen that way. If he jumps millions times, he will not change the hip bone. In order for this change to happen, you have a change on the genes. You need added information. You need a coding system to produce these different joints that we're going to discuss. So these are different skeletons. That's the human, and we have discussed that. You see the gibbon is the hands are the upper arm is the upper limb really is very, very long. Here the upper limb is still long and the spine is straight. The spine is straight. The spine is straight in the orangutan and the gorilla on the chimpanzee. So from this really only you can understand we cannot just develop from a fish that developed a spinal cord, and because of that, we humans got a spinal cord. It means there is one designer who designed the different creatures, but he created man and woman, created the human race on his own image with lots of other things that differentiate us from all the other animals, because we have the image of God. We can communicate with God. We have the moral standards, lots of difference, but we are looking at the anatomy that is completely different. So let us now move to the hip joint. The hip joint is very important because it's a strong joint. When I stand, it carries my weight, and the knee joint has to lock. So it forms a big column in the lower limbs to carry the weight of the person. So the hip joint is a stable joint. If you compare that to the shoulder, in the shoulder, you need a big range of movements. In the hip, you need range of movements, but you are looking for stability more than the range of movements. So let me just remind you, there will be lots of names of muscles and things, and don't worry if you don't grasp all of that. But we will look at this video and we will discuss how things are working in a simple way. So this is the sacrum, and that's called sacroiliac joint because this is the ilium. And in the ilium here, we have a big cavity here called acetabulum, and that's where the head of the femur enters in. This bone, the big bone in the thigh, is called the femur, and this is the head of the femur, and is covered by cartilage to allow for smooth movements inside this joint. And there is a very thin fluid which is lubricating this all the time. I thank God I don't have to feel that fluid from time to time. It is secreted because God has made it in a wonderful design. And then there is something greater trochanter and lesser trochanter, but the important thing here is the neck of the femur. And the neck of the femur, there is a blood supply here. And in elderly people, when they fell, that the neck of the femur is usually fractured, and it needs a surgical procedure to sort that. So let us go through this structure again, the hip joint, and I'll stop the video from time to time just to highlight a few points.
Divided into several categories. These include bones and joints, ligaments and tendons, muscles, nerves, blood vessels, and bursa.
So these are the structures that we're going to examine around the hip joint, and they have to run really in a very orderly manner in order for all the movements of the hip to happen, but that will not catch a nerve or a blood vessel or disturb anything. So let us look at that in detail now.
The hip is a true ball and socket joint. This arrangement gives the hip the large amount of motion needed for daily activities like walking, squatting, and stair climbing. Understanding how the different layers of the hip are arranged and connected can help you understand how the hip works, how it can be injured, and how challenging recovery can be when this joint is injured or damaged by arthritis. The deepest layer of the hip includes the bones and the joints. The next layer is made up of the ligaments of the joint capsule. And finally, these ligaments are covered by the important tendons and the muscles that help move the leg. The important structures of the hip can be divided into several categories. These include bones and joints, ligaments and tendons, muscles, nerves, blood vessels, and bursa. The bones that form the hip are the femur or the thigh bone and the pelvis. The top end of the femur is shaped like a ball. This ball is called the femoral head. The femoral head fits into a round socket on the side of the pelvis. This socket is called the acetabulum. The femoral head is attached to the rest of the femur by a short section of bone called the femoral neck. A large bump juts outward from the top of the femur next to the femoral neck. This bump, called the greater trochanter, can be felt along the side of your hip. Large and important muscles connect to the greater trochanter. Articular cartilage is the material that covers the ends of the bones of any joint. Articular cartilage is about 1/4 of an inch thick in the large weight-bearing joints like the hip. Articular cartilage is white and shiny and has a rubbery consistency. It is slippery, which allows the joint surfaces to slide against one another without causing any damage. The function of articular cartilage is to absorb shock and provide an extremely smooth surface to make motion easier. We have articular cartilage essentially everywhere that two bony surfaces move against one another or articulate.
So that's really very interesting to understand that there is articular cartilage to make a smooth surface, to move against a smooth surface. So all these movements are done without any pain or trouble. People who develop arthritis, they have this surface becomes very rough, and hitting against a rough surface, that's the reason of pain and limitation of movement. So that's just the start of understanding this wonderful joint.
In the hip, articular cartilage covers the end of the femur and the socket portion of the acetabulum in the pelvis. The cartilage is especially thick in the upper and back part of the socket, as this is where most of the force occurs during walking and running. Ligaments are soft tissue structures that connect bones to bones. There are several important ligaments in and around the hip. Surrounding the hip joint, the joint capsule is formed by...
And this is another layer, which is the ligaments. And the ligaments are tough tissues, which is connecting bone to bone. And they are forming a capsule, a watertight capsule around this joint, which is rotating inside the cavity of the acetabulum. So let us continue to see that structure.
Group of strong ligaments that connect the top of the femur to the acetabulum. A joint capsule is a watertight sac that surrounds a joint. These ligaments of the joint capsule are the main source of stability for the hip. They help hold the femoral head in place in the acetabulum or socket. Small ligament connects the very tip of the femoral head to the acetabulum. This ligament, called the ligamentum teres, doesn't play a role in controlling hip movement like the main hip ligaments. It does, however, have a small artery within the ligament that brings a very small blood supply to part of the femoral head. Tendons are soft tissue structures that connect muscles to bones. A long tendon band, called the iliotibial band.
So this is the muscle, and this is the white thing is the tendon. So the muscle will allow contraction, but the tendons will allow attachment to the bones. So the muscle doesn't attach to the bone directly. It has to have this fibrous tissue to allow it to join the bones. So when you join when you connect 2 points and there is a joint in between, you can move that joint. So let us continue following that.
Runs alongside the femur from the hip to the knee. The iliotibial band provides a connection point for several of the large hip muscles. A tight iliotibial band can cause hip and knee problems. A special type of ligament forms a unique structure inside the hip called the labrum. The labrum is attached almost completely around the edge of the acetabulum. The shape and the way the labrum is attached create a deeper cup for the acetabular socket. This small rim of cartilage can be injured and cause pain and clicking in the hip joint. The hip is surrounded by large, thick muscles. 3 gluteal muscles, the gluteus minimus, gluteus medius, and gluteus maximus, make up the muscles of the buttock on the back of the hip. These muscles extend or pull the thigh backwards and abduct or pull the thigh away from the other leg. These muscles are also important for keeping the pelvis level as we shift the weight from one leg to the other during walking. The inner thigh is formed by the adductor muscles. The main action of the adductors is to pull the leg inward toward the other leg. The muscles that flex the hip or pull the thigh forward are in front of the hip joint. These include the iliopsoas and the rectus femoris. The iliopsoas muscle is a very deep muscle that begins attached to the lower spine. It travels out of the pelvis to connect on the inside edge of the upper femur. The rectus femoris is one of the quadriceps muscles, the large group of muscles on the front of the thigh. There's also a small, thin, strap-like muscle called the sartorius muscle that runs from the pelvis across the knee and connects to the upper tibia just below the knee joint. Several small muscles travel from inside the pelvis across the back of the hip joint and attach to the back of the upper femur. These muscles help to stabilize the hip joint and rotate the leg outwards. Together as a group, these muscles are called the external rotators of the hip. Finally, the hamstring muscles run down the back of the thigh. These muscles originate at the bottom of the pelvis. Because the hamstring muscles cross the back of the hip joint on their way to the knee, they help to extend the hip, pulling it backwards. All of the nerves that travel down the thigh pass by the hip. The main nerves are the femoral nerve in front and the sciatic nerve in the back of the hip. A smaller nerve called the obturator nerve also goes to the inside of the hip. These nerves carry the signals from the brain to the muscles that move the hip. The nerves also carry signals back to the brain about sensations such as touch, pain, and temperature. Traveling along with the nerves are the large vessels that supply the lower limb with blood. The large femoral artery begins deep within the pelvis. It passes by the front of the hip area and goes down toward the inner edge of the knee. If you place your hand on the front of your upper thigh, you may be able to feel the pulsing of this large artery. The femoral artery has a deep branch called the profunda femoris. Profunda means deep. The profunda femoris sends two vessels that go through the hip joint capsule. These vessels are the main blood supply for the femoral head. As mentioned earlier, the ligamentum teres contains a small blood vessel that gives a very small supply of blood to the top of the femoral head. Other small vessels form within the pelvis and supply the back portion of the buttocks and hip. Where friction occurs between muscles, tendons, and bones, there is usually a structure called a bursa. A bursa is a thin sac of tissue that contains fluid to lubricate the area and reduce friction. The bursa is a normal structure that is produced by the body in response to friction between two structures. A bursa that sometimes causes problems in the hip is sandwiched between the bump on the outer hip, the greater trochanter, and the muscles and tendons that cross over the bump. This bursa, called the greater trochanteric bursa, can become irritated and inflamed, causing a condition called trochanteric bursitis. Another bursa sits between the iliopsoas muscle and the hip joint, where the iliopsoas tendon passes in front of the hip joint. When this bursa becomes inflamed, the condition is called iliopsoas bursitis. A third bursa covers the ischial tuberosity, the bump of bone in your buttocks that you sit on. And again, inflammation of this bursa is called ischial bursitis. As you can see, the hip is complex with a design that provides a great amount of stability. It also allows good mobility and range of motion for doing a wide range of daily activities. Many powerful muscles connect to and cross by the hip joint, making it possible for us to accelerate quickly during actions like running and jumping.
I think that is really a very detailed sort of a video, which give us the understanding of how complicated this joint is. I'll take you back to the video that we watched at the beginning of the program, when Sir Attenborough says that because our fishy ancestors developed the spinal cord and legs, we have now our legs that we walk upon. I don't see that is a very scientific statement, because you have seen the complicated structure of the hip joint. This doesn't happen by chance and times and laws of nature. Give me millions and millions and millions of years, that will never form a hip joint. that will never form all these muscles attached to it. All this, even what's called bursa. The bursa is a little sac full of fluid. It's like a pillow to allow for these tendons when they pass, they don't cause friction. This is very intricate. The blood vessels, the blood supply and the nerve supply and the different movements and the control of these movements and the central nervous system to control that. That did not happen by chance and time and laws of nature. We are created by a wonderful creator, Almighty God, who loved us enough to come and die for us when we disobeyed him. So I'll take you to another joint. I'll take you to another joint, which is the knee joint. And the knee joint is formed between the femur, that's the thigh bone, and the leg bone, which is called the tibia. And there is a smaller or a thinner bone running alongside called the fibula. And we'll see that joint is very important because we can sit down and we can bend the knee. But when we stand, the knee has to rotate to form a strong column to allow us to carry our body weight. And there are ligaments controlling this. We hear about this anterior cruciate ligament and posterior cruciate ligament and people who play football and some injuries that can happen to these ligaments. So I'll take you through this video to give you the impression or the understanding of how this joint operates. And I'd like you to always think, did we develop this joint as a result of the fish developing our spinal cord? I don't think so. But let us listen and watch that video together.
There are 4 major ligaments that stabilize the knee. The medial collateral ligament is on the inner side of the knee, and the lateral collateral ligament on the outer side. The collateral ligaments give sideways stability to the knee. Two ligaments cross in the center of the knee. They are called the cruciate ligaments. The ligament toward the front is the anterior cruciate ligament, or ACL, and the one towards the back is the posterior cruciate ligament. The ACL prevents the lower bone.
Right. Yeah. So we have seen now the cruciate ligaments, anterior and posterior, and lateral ligaments. We need in the knee a movement, and we need stability as well. Otherwise, it will be wobbly and it will not carry our body weight. This is a very complicated structure, and it needs a designer, and it needs the God, the creator, to create this. And we cannot, as I said, and I repeat saying, we cannot just develop this structure because the fish developed a spinal cord and a leg. That's impossible, really, medically. So let us move on now to the foot, and the anatomy of the foot is very complicated because all this body weight has to be transmitted here and then moved into special bones here and muscles, obviously, and nerves and blood vessels to be able to operate the foot so we can walk properly as humans.
Foot can be divided into several categories. These include bones and joints, ligaments and tendons, muscles, nerves, and blood vessels.
So you see how complicated that is. You have the bone structure, you have the joints to operate, you need ligaments to support this, you need tendons of the muscle to be inserted in special places to allow for the movements, you need muscles to operate this, you need nerves to supply the muscle, you need blood vessels. So let us see how we walk really.
There are multiple joints between the tarsal bones. When the foot is twisted in one direction by the muscles of the foot and leg, these bones lock together and form a very rigid structure. When they are twisted in the opposite direction, they become unlocked and allow the foot to conform to whatever surface the foot is contacting.
You see how this foot is working? When you move in one direction, it locks to form a big solid sort of support. and there are arches in this foot to allow us to do that. And then when you move in the other direction, it is loosened to adjust to any sort of surface you are running against. I like you to compare that to the foot of an ape. This is a hand and the foot really, because this is the thumb and 4 digits. We have 5 as well, but it doesn't mean we came from the same family. You see the gap between the thumb here and the 4 fingers, because this is designed to catch on trees, to be able to hold on trees and keep the balance. And I'll show you the hand. Let us compare this to our foot. Yes, there are 5 digits and there are 5 digits here, but that doesn't mean we came from each other. We are not cousins. It means there is a designer who designed our foot in a wonderful way and intricate way, and he designed the foot and the hand of the gorilla completely different. So that is the hand of an ape, which again there are 5. It doesn't mean because they have 5 digits and we have 5 digits, we are the same family. Not at all. It means there is one designer who designed things suitable for our life as humans compared to the life of apes in the jungle. So this very quick review of the different joints, starting from the spinal cord and then talking about the hip joint and the knee joint, and we touched on the foot. We haven't discussed the ankle in detail. The ankle is another very complicated joint. All of that just to confirm to you that the assumption that we have seen in Sir David Attenborough video, that because our fishy ancestor developed a spinal cord, we developed all these structures to allow us to stand and walk. That cannot happen naturally. It needs a supernatural intervention, and this is the idea of the Creator God. And that's very clear from the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. Do you know, Simon, a friend of mine who's an atheist came to me once and said, I know who you are Nagy Iskander, you believe in creation, I'm not going to shake hands with you. I said, welcome. I said, if you don't believe in the creation, you have to believe in the beginning there was nothing, and nothing had exploded and formed everything. This is not scientific principle. I have a better starting point. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. Beginning is a time. God is the source of energy and intelligence. Heaven and earth is matter and space. So this is more scientific starting point when you start with the first chapter of the Bible and the first verse of the Bible. Because having a God in our life gives our life a meaning and gives us a relationship with God. And when this relationship was broken because of sin, the Lord Jesus Christ came to pay the penalty of our sin.
Thanks, Nagy. That's really amazing to think about. And again, I think you've shown how clear the human body is uniquely designed and could not have come from an ape-like creature. Well, we're going to continue next week with the third installment of this series. So be sure to join us. It's been really great having you with us today, Nagy.
Thank you, Simon. See you soon.
Okay, God bless everyone.
Thanks.